how many people have been to Wellfleet? About half of you. So Wellfleet, if you haven't been there, is about 2/3 of the way out the island, out the peninsula. I always like to start with the end of the last ice age when I talk about history. So the Cape was created by the retreat of the last glacier that came down, pushing sand in front of it. So it's really a big sandbar, and this, a fairly recent development. And a lot of the Cape's identity is this sort of transient nature of the land. The land is always being eroded by the ocean, and the sand is blown away, and there's this sort of ethos that developed on the Cape of sort of flexibility and a kind of ad hoc approach to building. So the Nauset Indians who lived on the Cape for a few thousand years before the Europeans got there built these wetus or wigwams, which were made of bent saplings and then covered with bark or reed mat, and they would move these seasonally, so they would leave up the frame and they would move the skin. So there's this long tradition of this sort of type of building where there's a very light frame and a very light skin, and you can kind of take the parts and move them around. There's also a long tradition on the Cape of moving buildings. So buildings would either be floated on rafts or taken apart, which was called flaked, where they would take the building apart, take the post and beam frame apart, and move it. Also, soon after the Europeans arrived, the Cape was clear cut and there were no more trees. So wood became very scarce, and so as soon as there was a shipwreck, which was very frequent, the townspeople would go out and take the boat apart. So in old buildings, you'll often find parts of boats. So on the Cape during the Depression, you can see there was almost no trees. That's the Atlantic on the right, and Horseleech Pond is on the left there. And this is part of what is now the Cape Cod National Seashore and National Park. So in the Depression, Wellfleet's population crashed down to about 300 people, and there were a lot of empty houses. So 800 acres of that land in that last slide was acquired by a dentist and inventor in Boston, Dr. Rollins, who then left it to his nephew, Jack Phillips, who was from a prominent New England family. He started occupying this 800 acres and building these sort of ad hoc structures. The first one of these was a painting studio he built out of salvaged wood, and when I say these are salvaged, I mean this is like driftwood, stuff that washed up. These are very, very do-it-yourself, improvised buildings, very often using old window sashes, and there's sort of vernacular developed here, which was by this group in the book we call them the Bohemian Brahmins, but they were kind of ne'er-do-wells from old New England families who came to the Cape and either bought or inherited huge pieces of land when land was almost free. Land was $20 an acre back here during the Depression. And so they had all been to Europe and seen early modern architecture, but none of them had gone to architecture school. So they started just building their own kind of vernacular modernism. Jack Phillips bought a trainload of old army barracks just after the war, and he would put up these army barracks on this 800 acres wherever would be a good spot. He thought would be a good spot for a house. So this is 2 of those barracks put together, and this is the house of Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, and his children and grandchildren still live there. So this is just by way of saying that these were very low budget kind of cottage in the woods These are down at the end of long dirt roads. So this is Charles Jenks, the godfather of postmodern architecture, which is, just going to cover postmodernism here before I get into modernism, but Jenks actually grew up in Wellfleet, and this is him in front of one of those army barracks. And his own house is 3 of those army barracks put together. They're all still there, and they're all actually lived in by, in many cases, the original occupants. He also built the Garaggia Rotunda, which is a prefabricated single-car garage, which he put up and then covered with all of this postmodern gewgaws from the lumberyard, painted all different colored blue. He always has this in his books it's sort of his homage to the Villa Rotunda. And the Victoria and Albert Museum a few years ago did a show on postmodernism, and they reconstructed a corner of this of the Garaggia Rotunda. Of the Bohemian Brahmins, as we called them, Jack Phillips was one, Jack Hall was another. He came to Wellfleet in the late 30s and bought this old farmhouse from around 1730. You can see there's no trees, so that's Cape Cod Bay. In the distance, you could see as far as there, you could actually if you get up on a rise, you could see the ocean and the bay and about 4 ponds, So Jack Hall was a really interesting guy, an autodidact, taught himself how to do carpentry, architecture, painting. So he bought this sort of homestead out on a place called Boundbrook Island. And then he bought some other historic barns from around the area and assembled them and made this actual little working farm. And he restored a number of these old farmhouses that had been long abandoned. And this was actually his house. And you can see something common to this group of people is that they loved the old historic buildings because they considered them honest, straightforward, functionalist, handmade buildings. But they had no compunction about blasting giant windows in them or totally altering them. So they kind of took them as found objects that they were altering. I mean, these were abandoned buildings. So his most remarkable building is the Hatch Cottage, built in '61, which is one of the 3 houses that we have restored. So once again, I think you can see this is a distant cousin of the Nauset Indians house. It's a super light frame with the sort of light skin hung on it. This is it under construction. So Jack Hall never studied architecture, but he did work for George Nelson for a couple of years just before doing the Hatch House. And he went to Moscow and helped build the Jungle Gym, which was the big scaffolding structure that Nelson built to display U.S. products. And you can see the relationship to the Hatch House. George Nelson also designed this prefabricated aluminum house, which was never built, but it's cubes connected by walkways, which is very much like the Hatch House. This is interior. You can see what you're seeing there is the back of the siding. So there's no wall cavity. There's just a sort of a space frame and tongue and groove 1x4 fir. So it's just a skin. There's no insulation. There's no heat. So we have, of the 3 buildings we've restored, one of them has heat, one is sort of 3 seasons, and this one is purely a summer cottage. This is a drawing showing the house with the shutters open. So the idea of the Hatch House is there are these 7 by 7 foot cubes, which close completely in the winter and then open up in the summer, and you can vary the the amount of light and air you get by opening and closing the shutters. So when we acquired this house from the park, a long-term lease on this house from the National Park Service, it was in a very advanced state of decay. So basically, the short version of why these buildings were abandoned is that in '59, the Kennedys mostly introduced the legislation to create the Cape Cod National Seashore to stop overdevelopment. People argued about that for 2 years, and it passed in '61. And if you started building your house in the park in that 2-year period, you were basically gambling. And those people lost, and in '61, the park bought them out and generally gave them 25 years, at which point they were supposed to vacate, and the buildings were supposed to be demolished. So Ruth Hatch lived here till she was 93 on a special year-to-year lease, and when she died, the house reverted to the National Park Service. And right about that time, I was starting the trust as a way to create a vehicle that could negotiate leases with the Park Service to lease these buildings. So the house was completely restored. There were a lot of challenges, some things mentioned by others. These are very, very small and experimental buildings. We're sort of fortunate in that these were built with very prosaic lumberyard materials. So mostly everything, everything it's made of is still available. There's no exotic materials, but they're very lightly constructed. And you can see the deck is 1x4 fir, which is vertical, which was very bouncy. So when we rebuilt that, we rebuilt it in pallets with threaded rod in the blocks. So as mentioned, we try to improve the performance of the building in ways that are invisible and that don't compromise the intent. We were very fortunate with this house in that we started talking to the Hatch family before they gave up the house. So they put everything in storage, and when we finished the restoration, the Hatch family put everything back the way it was. So we have all the art, the books, the furniture, everything as it originally was, which is very important in this house. This house, Robert Hatch was the editor of The Nation magazine, and he was very close with Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, who both lived there. So this was kind of a lefty salon, and I do have pictures of them all there talking and drinking martinis. So this was actually the second house that we restored. This house is, I think that it's 600 square feet of interior space. So this is, like, qualifies as a tiny house, I think. Not that it feels like it, but. The third one of these Bohemian Brahmins was Hayden Walling. He came to Wellfleet. His parents were prominent American socialists, William English Walling and Anna Strunsky, and they were friends with John Reed and hung out in Provincetown. And so he came to Wellfleet and as an 18-year-old bought a piece of land from Jack Phillips and started building his house. He actually used bricks and old beams that were left over from a settlement from the 1700s that was abandoned. So he was actually using things that were lying around, and he assembled it out of parts of other old buildings, like the tower was a water tank in Wellfleet Center, which he dragged down and incorporated. So again, these are sort of hybrid of modern of truly antique buildings and modernism in this kind of it seems like kind of an unusual vernacular, local vernacular. So Hayden Walling built a lot of great houses. He actually was completely self-taught carpenter. He became a very good builder later on, but he, in the beginning, he really would just, these were very ad hoc buildings and very inexpensive. A lot of the clients were artists or professors. So the budgets for some of these buildings were $5,000, $6,000. This was the house of James Lachey, the painter. This was his studio made of plate glass and plywood. This was originally untempered plate glass, and I actually did the restoration of this this building a few years ago, and we did replace it with insulated glass, and we replicated all the details, so you really can't tell. And he was very creative with getting big window walls using just studs. He would just make a stud wall and then clad it in strips of glass. You also couldn't get big pieces of plate glass, and out on the outer cape. And he actually would take the plate glass and overlap it like clapboards in some cases. So, the interior. So at the same time, the late 30s, of course, the Bauhaus folks had all left Germany, and a lot of them were in London, living in Hampstead in the Isokon building. And in 1937, Gropius got a letter from Harvard asking him to come and take over start basically what's became the GSD, Graduate School of Design, and transform Harvard from basically a Beaux-Arts school into a sort of version of the Bauhaus. Brodeur had been at the Bauhaus. He was the youngest student and eventually became the master of the furniture shop, and we all know what happened there. So part of this inner circle of Brodeur and Gropius was Santi Shavinsky, in the middle, Herbert Bayer, and Moholy-Nagy. And in 37, the whole gang came to the Cape and spent the summer of 37 in Planting Island. So this was sort of a reunion of the Bauhaus, and then they all, that's Moholy-Nagy, in the middle is Santi Shavinsky and Herbert Bayer. Then they all took off to Black Mountain College and various places. The first of the Europeans who came to Wellfleet and bought land was Serge Chermayeff, Chechen architect by way of London, and his wife Barbara, and Ivan Chermayeff, who just passed away, the great graphic designer, Peter Chermayeff, who you're going to meet on the tour. I think he's going to be showing the Chermayeff houses on the tour on Sunday. So Chermayeff came up with these ideas for lightweight buildings, the first of which he built as his own studio. So these were, again, light wood structures with a skin. In this case, it was actually homosote, which is pressed paper. So these were kind of, they look sort of like a house of cards. They're very lightly constructed, and you could say almost temporary structures because of their building materials. So this provides all kinds of preservation challenges. Also, this window, this was the typical window. It looks sort of like a manufactured thing, but up close, it's made of 2x4s with just putty, to keep the water out. So these are really ad hoc structures. But again, if you wanted a bigger house, you just added more bays. It was based on an 8-foot bay. And there are 6 of these buildings in Wellfleet, and they're all still intact. Some have been, restored well. Some have been sort of unsympathetically restored. But these are privately owned buildings that are in the national park. So if you had a house built before '59, it was grandfathered in. And if you built between '59 and '61, the park reclaimed them. And then there was a total moratorium on new building within the park. So Chermayev's house became a real sort of unofficial think tank starting in the mid-40s. That's Bernard Radovsky on the left and Juri Kepish on the right. So the three of them really and very influential sort of stream of kind of, I'd say, sort of counterculture modernism, very anti-formal, very interested in the end user, very influenced by Japanese and sort of pre-industrial building. So Getty had a great show on Radovsky probably 4 or 5 years ago. Was that? Anyway, Radovsky wrote Architecture Without Architects, and Kepish started the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT. So by the mid-40s, Gropius and Zonti here are in Wellfleet, and Brodeur arrived in Wellfleet in the mid-40s and bought this piece of land and came up, basically, his first Cape design became his longhouse prototype, which became one of his 2 main house prototypes, the binuclear and the longhouse. So there are 4 versions of this house in Wellfleet, of the longhouse. And then he would have the A section and then a B section, which he would add if you needed more room. This is the Wise House. And these are all mostly privately owned houses. And this is Brodeur in 1950 at his own house, which we will be seeing on Sunday too on the tour. That's a view from the porch and a view of the living room. So we do an artist scholar residency every year, and we've had it sort of changes every year. We've had an affordable housing competition because Wellfleet has an affordable housing issue. We had one year we had a symposium on rural urban design issues, which we held at Chermayev's house in this big room where he used to meet. And next year, for the Bauhaus Centennial, we're doing a show on the art and furniture in Broyer's Wellfleet house, which Brodeur had a terrific collection of small pieces by Clay and Calder, et cetera. And he made this kind of brutalist summer furniture for this house out of cement blocks and big pieces of slate and these couches that were made of big chunks of lumber. So he made this really sort of Neanderthal, lumberyard modern furniture, which is really great. So this house is owned by Broyer's son, and it was, even though it was privately owned, it was in a very advanced state of decay until recently. And since I got to know the son, I've been slowly working on it, working on sort of one piece at a time. This house also has all of Brodur's books and his furniture, and I mean, the house is pretty much intact. It's been quite neglected, but it's very, it's a little bit like Pompeii or something. That's Zonti Shavinsky when he got older on Brodur's porch, and Connie Brodeur on the right. And the woman on the left, in the first edition of the book, I couldn't identify her, but it turns out she's still alive. I found her in New York. Her name is Christina Bevington. She's French, Senegalese, and I think one of the only women of color that was a registered architect in the early 60s, but she was working in Brodur's office. Juliet Kepish was a great children's book author and illustrator, and 2 summers ago we did a big show of all the children's books created by this group, which was over 200 children's books created by the extended families of this whole group. So anyway, there's a lot of sort of cultural parts to this story which we try to bring to light. And this is Kepish's house by Brodeur, which is kind of a very close facsimile of his own. And Barry Bergdahl from MoMA had asked at the very beginning of the project said, there's a Brodeur House in Dennis, Mass., but nobody knows where it is. Can you find it? And so I went searching for this house for years, and I finally got a reporter interested, and she went to the Registry of Deeds and found the family name. And anyway, the house was there. It was completely mint with all the original furniture, and the original family still owned it. And this is a big budget binuclear Brodeur house. So this was like Shangri-La, completely amazing. So this is some kind of a testament to New England and modernism, how it's not on people's radar. In a lot of places, everyone would know that there was this really mint Brodeur house, and it was just on Cape Cod. We have houses from the 1600s, and people just there was a battle on sort of is this a historic building. So most of our funding for our restorations has come from the town through the Community Preservation Act, and so in order to get any funding, I have to go before town meeting and ask, and a majority of the town has to vote on it. So I had to go through an education process with the town to convince them that these were historic buildings and part of the sort of the patrimony of the historic town. So that has mostly been accepted, and people in Wellfleet are now proud of their modern houses. Most of them. This is the MoMA house, Brodeur's MoMA house, which you're going to see, and you can see that it's a very close. The back part of the Scott House in Dennis predates actually the MoMA house, but it's basically the same shape. And Brodeur was always just taking the same pieces and recombining them in different ways. Also came to Wellfleet in the early 50s, Paul Weidlinger, the great structural engineer who worked closely with Brodeur and Saarinen and that whole group. So Weidlinger came to Wellfleet in 53, bought some land across the pond from Brodeur, and built this house for himself. This one was taken by the park. Actually, this was donated to the park by Weidlinger's widow, and the park had no inkling really until the early 2000s that any of these buildings had any historic importance. So they let staff live in them, and then when they got too derelict, they would just abandon them and they would sit to rot. So this house was empty for over 15 years. And I'd say this house was kind of on the edge of being savable. It had a tar and gravel roof that had leaked. There were broken windows. There were animals living inside, and a tree had crushed the right corner. So this was really on the edge. But it looks great now. And yeah, thank you. And it was really hard to visualize this house until we kind of got to the stage of painting it, and then all of a sudden it looked incredible. So this was the third house that we restored. We actually got it in a lease from the National Park Service along with the Hatch House, so they gave us both houses in a combined lease, which was difficult because we had the money to do the Hatch House, and then we had to kind of raise money as we were doing the Weidlinger restoration. So as I say, we've gotten most of our funding from the Community Preservation Act, although for this house we did a Kickstarter campaign. We did an art auction of donated art from past artists in residence, and we had to borrow some money from this one. But the idea is that as each house is restored, that it supports itself through rentals. So basically, we do weekly summer rentals in season. That's a partially tax-deductible donation to the trust. And then we do our artist residency in the spring and fall. And they're mostly closed in the winter. So that's basically the business model, and it's worked. It's probably took about 10 years for us to get fully in the black and get all of our our debt's paid off. All the furniture in this house was either donated or on loan, or that's a Kepish painting on the right. So this is furniture either that I collected over the years or people donated, or we actually do quite a bit of trading of time in the house for furniture and art. Okay. Some other interesting houses in this area, the Marc house by Paul Brodeur, who was the architect in charge of the Carpenter Center. Olaf Hammerstrom, who worked closely with Aalto and Saarinen, did this house and a church in Wellfleet. Plus, he did about 8 houses in the area and a church. The Colony by Nathaniel Saltonstall. And this was the first house we restored, the Kugel Gips house by Charlie Zender. Other people in the area, Conrad Voxman, Florence Knoll, who came often with the Saarinen family. Aalto came in the mid-40s while he was teaching at MIT, and basically everybody came through. So we do tours in the summer. We do regular Sunday tours of our own houses, and then we usually do a tour of other houses. We did a tour of Martha's Vineyard 2 years ago, the terrific bunch of modern houses over there. This is the symposium we had in the Chermaeff's house. And this is the 4th house that we hope to restore starting this fall, which it will be another lease from the Park Service. The Kohlberg House, which has been empty since the late 90s. So that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Does your organization own the houses, or does the Park Service?
So we have long-term leases, and the Park Service owns them. Yeah.
And you can take the rental.
Yes.
Towards your organization.
Yeah, it's a very unusual situation for the National Park Service, and the Cape Cod National Seashore is quite a bit more experimental with leasing than most of the parks are, but they each have their own bylaws and et cetera. So this was sort of an experiment, and actually the fact that the town financed them and the park owns them and we've leased them, it was quite a interesting arrangement, and it was really grew out of just a, it was a grassroots effort, and it's an interesting situation. Last year, when I was talking to the park about the Kohlberg lease, I tried to find some other example around the country, and I couldn't find any. So of this exact type of situation, which is too bad because the Park Service has hundreds of historic buildings that are languishing, but they have been very resistant to adopting this as a model. The Park Service and in the Cape Cod National Seashore, actually, since we've been doing this, has taken a few of their buildings and are trying to sort of Airbnb them, which is interesting. In fact, I just furnished one of their modern houses so that they could more successfully rent it. But it's too bad that it can't be more. We also did a national registry. We participated with the park with a context study for the National Registry. And the 3 houses we have are all in the National Registry, and the 4th is eligible. Yeah.
Looking forward 20 years, is there enough money to pay people for the levy and so forth, or is this all about $100?
No, we're very small, so it's really. Oh yes. Does it generate enough money to pay salaries? Is that the question, basically? Yeah. Yeah, basically, each house does pay for itself, plus a little bit more into the fund for the next house. So it does work. I mean, we're very fortunate in that these are beautiful houses. They're in a national park, so the landscape is frozen in this pristine state. So they're really spectacular places. And so it does work economically. They do pay their own way, plus a bit more.
What are the range of your rents?
Our rents are like $37.50 a week in July and August, and $27.50 in June and September, and that's partially tax deductible. So that's roughly the rent of any house, with that in that location. So we actually trying to keep them, affordable, not make it too out of reach of people. And also, we made a very conscious decision that we wanted the houses occupied and used and enjoyed, since they were sort of laboratories for the architects that made them, and for the clients. So the clients were very often people teaching at Harvard or MIT, scientists, all kinds of creative work went on in the houses. They weren't just vacation houses. Yeah. Yeah. From the town, as far as so the question is, was there opposition from the town? Well, as I say, I had to go before town meeting every time. We don't have a mayor or anything. We just have a selectman, and it's like New England, small town governance. So that's always a little bit like a contentious, and everybody has opinions. There was one guy who was over 80 who was on the finance committee, and he would always stand up and say, "I'm older than these houses. These are not historic," and so anyway, the Kugel-Gibbs house, the first house we restored, was built in 1970, so that's quite recent, But I think that it's funny. The first time I went to get funding, people were just kind of confused, and it just sailed by them, And then the second time I went, they were like, "Hey, wait a minute, what are you doing?" Like they were. And then of course people are mad that they didn't have the idea first, and and they're mad that you're getting too much attention or whatever. So there's always going to be opposition, and so we actually, for the next house we are fully financed through a gift from the original family that owned it, and an art dealer who's using it as a retreat for her artists to come and stay there. So we have a bit of momentum now, and which is nice. So we actually are not probably won't have to do that again. Ask for funding from the town.
I think we have to.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.